Hello, everyone, and welcome to Partners in Promise's 2022 survey findings release. Thank you all for joining us today to learn more about our research on military special education and whether existing supports and standard outcome measurements are effective for military children. My name is Michelle Norman. I am the Executive Director and founder of Partners in Promise. We are a military families-led nonprofit whose mission is to protect the rights of military children in special education and disability communities to ensure they receive equal access to an education. We develop data-informed solutions that equip parents, inform leaders, and enable military children to thrive. And we have a fantastic lineup for you today. I am honored to introduce our presenters from our research team. Our lead researcher and COO is Jennifer Barnhill. In addition to her Partners in Promise role, Jennifer is an accomplished freelance writer and reporter with a focus on military families advocacy. She'll be walking us through the data findings. And also joining us is Dr. Amy Schumann with The Ohio State University, who is our IRB sponsor, and she's well known for her research and storytelling and disabilities. Additionally, moderating our chat today is Crystal Mahaney, Special Education Legal Analyst. Please feel free to type any questions that you have in the chat, and if we can't get to your question today, we'll make sure to answer it either through our follow-up newsletter or on our website. And we know that education is a community collective effort, and that is why we are thrilled about our panelists that will be joining us in our discussion portion of the webinar. They include Dr. David Cantrell, Deputy Director of the Office of Special Education Programs with the U.S. Department of Education, Ms. Tomeshia Barnes, and with the Department of Defense's Office of Special Needs, and Ms. Cindy Cipoletti, CEO of the Learning Disabilities Association of America. And today, we are honored to have Ms. Sheila Casey as a guest speaker. Sheila is currently the Deputy Director of Joining Forces, an initiative led by the First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden, to support our military and veteran communities. Sheila has tirelessly advocated for military and veteran families for over 40 years. She's had a long and successful career managing dynamic organizations at the intersection of media, government, and veteran affairs, including COO at CPR Media and Pluribus News, COO at The Hill for more than 20 years, and she served on many boards, advisory, and leadership councils within the MSO-VSO community. Sheila is also a two-time recipient of the Defense Distinguished Civilian Service Medal, the highest level of recognition given by the Department of Defense. Please welcome Ms. Sheila Casey.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Sheila Casey, the Deputy Director of Joining Forces, the First Lady's initiative supporting military and veteran families, caregivers, and survivors. Joining Forces has three lines of effort: advancing economic opportunity for military spouses, increasing the health and well-being of military families, and supporting military-connected children in their classrooms, helping to ease the burdens created by the highly mobile military lifestyle. Over the past 2 years, Joining Forces has been focused on driving change across the federal government, including through better collection and sharing of data to inform policy and program development. We know how important data is to making good decisions to support our military-connected community, and the survey results you are releasing today play an important role in informing decision makers across all sectors. To begin to address these challenges, the President's budget, released last week, proposed a comprehensive set of investments, $20 million in total, to ensure military-connected children with disabilities and other highly mobile children with disabilities maintain services when they change school districts. These include a new family assistance center that will provide military-connected parents with resources and support to ensure their children's rights are maintained. It also includes investments in a new digital tool to facilitate smooth and timely transfers of IEPs from school to school. And the administration is proposing to invest and scale up novel and innovative practices in order to build the evidence base on the most effective ways of meeting the educational needs of military-connected children with disabilities. We hope that you'll join us in urging Congress to support these investments. Michelle, Thank you and your entire staff for the great work that you do, elevating the concerns of military special education students and their families, ensuring that they have the same access to an education as civilian students. We at Joining Forces look forward to continuing to work with Partners in Promise and this community to build on this effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila, for that incredible update and for your kind words. This is a huge win for us and our military special education community. Families want to be seen and be heard, and they want change. And so that is what our research does. And we're grateful for your team for taking on such a very complicated and complex issue. We look forward to working together on these initiatives. And once again, thank you for joining us. Our audience today consists of families, educators, allies, and leaders. Before we dive into the findings, I would like to share some basic 101 concepts and terms about the lived experiences of military special education families. So first, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, known as IDEA, is a federal law that requires local education agencies to provide services to help students achieve annual educational goals. These goals are established through the creation of individualized education programs, which we call IEPs. IEPs are used to establish, deliver, and measure the education of children with disabilities. However, not all diagnoses or needs qualify students for educational support under IDEA. Others are supported by Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Which outlines very specific accommodations that student needs to successfully access their education. These accommodations are outlined in what we call 504 plans. And unlike IEPs, 504 plans do not focus on monitored goals. Now, although there are provisions in IDEA that speak to comparable services after a move, these federal laws do not fully take into account these very highly mobile military families, right, who move typically every 2 to 3 years. Those disruptions to the education journey impact all military families, but it's more intensive, more complicated when a military family has a child that they suspect has a disability or has been identified as having a disability. So what can we do as a military special education family, and what can they expect? Well, they can expect to hurry up and wait. Families report waiting for medical appointments with primary care doctors, for specialty referrals, and oh, by the way, they wait for their child's school to do their own evaluation. This is exacerbated when military moves further extend these wait times. Then, once families finally have a diagnosis, they must wait again to establish an IEP or 504 plan. Although IDEA outlines very specific timelines to avoid delays for families and students, this process can oftentimes take a significant amount of time. So these parents are exhausted by the time they get to the IEP table. They just learned about special education law in their state, and they're ready to get services and supports for their child. And just when they finally get that program in place, it's time to repeat the cycle all over again. This is that lived experience of an exceptional military family. So now let's dig into the data. It is my great pleasure to introduce our lead researcher and CEO, Jennifer Barnhill.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate that. Welcome, everybody. As Michelle mentioned, I'm the COO and lead researcher for Partners in Promise. I wanted to just let everyone know today, this is our first of 4 data releases based on our 2022 findings. And as you can see, we are covering special education outcomes today. Future papers and reports will cover adults in the Exceptional Family Member Program, followed by a paper on homeschooling. And lastly, we're going to cover how our educators and service providers experience when dealing with special education and our exceptional family members. But why we're here today, we're here to talk about very specific data. I'm happy to report we heard from a representative sampling of our military population, with the primary respondents coming from the active duty spouse community, which is in line with our industry standards across nonprofits within this space. We did hear from a slightly higher than anticipated rate of Navy families. However, we aggregate all of our data, so we did not report out anything specific for service branch because we really wanted to understand a snapshot of what is happening across all locations and service branches. So with that being said, we'll just jump right into what we're looking at today. So just to give a little bit of a background on Partners in Promise, this is the 3rd year that we've conducted our annual survey. In the first year, in 2020, in the heart of the pandemic, we were looking at family experiences with filing for due process claims. That's something that happens typically at the end of a special education experience in a location and kind of, gets that picture of what's happening once a family is about to move or at the end of that experience for that military family. And then in 2021, we looked at the beginning of the process. We wanted to understand how our families experience the establishment of an individualized education program or 504 plan when they are first identifying an issue. And then we also looked at what happens after they move to a new location and how they restart those processes. And so then this year, we really wanted to fill in that gap. What happens in the middle of these processes? And so while the student is in a location for 2 to 3 years, how are their individualized education programs serving them? So we looked at 4 main elements. We wanted to understand, because of the highly mobile military lifestyle, how our military parents play a role in achieving some long-term educational outcome goals for our students, because they might be that only through line for that student over the course of their education. We also wanted to understand the role of IEPs and 504 plans in achieving and delivering a free and appropriate public education. And lastly, we looked at 2 common benchmarks and measures for outcome success, which were standardized testing participation and being on track to receive a standard high school diploma. So with that being said, we'll just jump right into the findings. That way we can get to the questions at the end. First finding was related to parent and educator agreement. We found that special education program a child was found eligible for is connected to specific educational outcomes. So what does this mean? So as a family moves to a new location, they may or may not have an IEP or 504 plan or a diagnosis in hand. For those who did have a diagnosis, we were happy to report that 74.5% of our families did say that that's the school district in the 2021 to 2022 school year did recognize their child's diagnosis. However, when we asked those same families, only 63% of parents reported that their school recognized the educational impact of those diagnoses. And so why does this matter? Well, if a student's disability is not fully recognized by a school, our parents are feeling less supported, and the school may not be offering the adequate support for that particular student's needs. Our families who had mental health diagnoses or ADHD diagnoses were more likely to report this level of disagreement between schools and recognizing their educational impact of the diagnosis. Finding number 2, as I mentioned, we looked once a family is established, they have their 504 plan, they have their IEP. We wanted to look at how family goals helped set their child up for success to achieve long-term goals. Our finding number 2 indicated that our IEP goals may not adequately support military students' long-term educational outcome goals. And furthermore, the existence of these long-term educational outcome goals was not related to a family's demographic factors, so rank or branch of service or location, but rather it was related to their familiarity with special education law and the services and supports that are available to them as military in the military community. Happy to report that 86% of our families did have a long-term educational outcome goal for their student. And these goals did vary by student, by diagnoses, with some hoping to achieve, to reach grade level. Some wanted to have a successful post-secondary experience. There were many different goals, and the achievement of those goals is something we're always looking to, regardless of what the goals were themselves. The military special education families who did have goals for their students, 54% of them indicated that their annual IEP goals did not support their long-term educational outcome goals. So IEP goals are annual. And so if these annual goals are not helping those students progress incrementally towards their long-term goals, then the traditional special education system may not be working as intended for military students. Finding number 3. So we're getting into some of those common benchmarks for outcomes. Although the majority of our military children aged 8 and older who participated in the survey did participate in statewide testing, this number is lower than state participation rates, which average about 95%, and the federal alternate assessment guidelines. For those who did indicate that their student did not participate in annual statewide testing, 23% of those families indicated that their child was not eligible to participate due to their special education status. So although this finding did not explicitly say that their student was participating in an alternate assessment, more data are required to understand if military students in special education are participating in the same rates as their civilian counterparts and in the same rate as their general education military student counterparts. Finding number 4 out of 5. We are looking here at our graduation requirements, another standard outcome measure for military students and for civilian students. Being on track to receive a standard high school diploma has a significant connection to many positive educational outcomes for military special education students. We know that our parents' goals included graduation with a standard high school diploma. However, there is that relationship between achievement of those long-term educational outcome goals and being on track to achieve or to receive a standard diploma. 58% of participants indicated that who were on track to receive a standard diploma indicated they were also on track to achieve their long-term goals. Whereas the non-standard diploma track participants, only 30% were also on track to achieve their long-term goals. And again, remember, these goals varied from person to person and were set by the parents to be achievable goals that were challenging. And still, this track is something that was an indicator for us. We'll see more of the connection to our recommendations later with Michelle. However, there is a relationship between participating in standardized testing and graduating with a standard diploma. Those who indicated that they were not participating in standardized testing may not know until it is too late in the process that their child is also not on track to graduate with a standard diploma. So that makes these educational outcome benchmarks very important to note. And our last finding for today, finding number 5, what is the impact of all of these experiences on our military families? And I'm happy to report, though, it's a bittersweet finding because we had a majority of our families indicated that the special education process did cause stress, with 78.1% saying that it negatively impacted their stress levels. However, this did not have a significant impact on the family's desire to continue serving on active duty. So that is a really important thing to remember as we are looking to support our military families in EFMP and in special education. It's also important to note that although the Exceptional Family Member Program did not have as negative an impact on the stress levels of families, it still did have a negative impact. And that is something we hope to work alongside our partners to help improve those numbers. And now I want to turn over to our research partner from The Ohio State University, Dr. Amy Schumann, to give some more insights into what is happening via our qualitative findings.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be here with all of you. This is really a moment of celebration that came as somewhat of a surprise to me. And I just wanted to note this this exciting news that we have that Jill Biden's group is interested in supporting families with children with special needs in the military. It's very exciting. I took a look at the qualitative data, the many comments that maybe some of you who are listening today sent in, and I wanted to express my appreciation to you for taking the time to somewhat extensive comments on your experiences. As we just heard, although families experience a lot of stress especially in finding services when they have to relocate, by and large said that they want to remain in the military. They also, some of them said that they wanted to remain in the military because it provided the kind of secure employment that they needed to support their families, though some of them commented that they would need, especially the military spouses, that they would need to curtail their career plans to get services for their children. So that's something worth taking note of. Many of the people who wrote in described the lack of continuity from one assignment to another that we've just heard about, and the consequences for their children who then have a gap in their services. One parent, for example, described having to start all over fighting. This is a quote: to start all over fighting for services or accommodations with the school, start all over with the doctors and therapists, start all over with tutors. It takes an enormous amount of time and effort to set all of those things up. Also, parents described being asked for continued requests for documentation of their children's medical and educational histories, and then even after providing those documents, not receiving the services that their children needed. Also, I wanted to mention that although many of the parents expressed gratitude to the excellent teachers who did eventually provide continuity for their children, almost all of them did anticipate a delay in receiving those services. And then many of them described what they described as discriminatory obstacles. The last thing I wanted to say is that, as many of you listening probably know, navigating the special education system requires learning an entirely new world to you, learning how things work, the different kinds of requirements that you need to meet to get the services for your children. And military families have to learn those systems over and over. So I'll conclude there. I just wanted to add that I'm a professor of disability studies, but I'm also the parent of a 36-year-old young man who's been through this whole system, who has intellectual disabilities. So I've been in the trenches with many of you.
Thank you, Dr. Schumann and Jennifer, for summarizing those survey results, in particular those stories. You know, Dr. Schumann, it is quite a bittersweet, but it is good to know that our families still want to serve despite those obstacles. And that's why we're here, to make sure that we can improve this process for them so that they can continue to do what they're called to do for this great country. So thank you for sharing those things with us. Okay, so let's talk. 3 years worth of data has really given us those big picture insights into the special ed world. Based on this data, we developed not just recommendations for our families, but for those who support them. So let's just jump right in. As we mentioned earlier, the military parent, is that only constant that participates and essentially manages that child's special education program. And it's also clear that the more informed you are, the more positive outcomes you have for your child. So parents, you need to get ahead of the game. You need to set and review those long-term educational goals to include high school standard diploma, and keep that on the radar at every IEP meeting so that you can work towards building a strong IEP. And I know that, our military families are asking questions throughout this process. Again, make sure to ask, is my child taking those standardized tests? Are they on track to graduate with a standard diploma? Do not wait to that first transition meeting that sometimes doesn't happen until age 16, because by then it's too late to get back on that diploma track. And last, I want to say we see you. That caregiver burnout is real. And whether it be educational, whether it's medical or military life driven, parents need support at that IEP table. Bring someone with you to that IEP meeting to help with that stress. You just don't have to do this all alone. All right, so our educators, we know that there's a lot being asked of you. And there can be, though, intentional efforts made to ease that military family transition. So if you can, try to identify the military children with IEPs first before school begins. Parents report feeling frustrated when they follow all the rules. They send an IEP ahead of time, and then they find out that their child's teachers have not even had a chance, to look at that IEP, but in the first few weeks of school. That can really make or break the dynamics of that IEP team for the rest of that child's time at the school. And remember, these child's parents are that common thread of that IEP journey. Help those families by discussing those critical milestones so that your child can stay on track of their long-term educational goal. And last, please be aware of those supports that are available to our military families that maybe the parents are not aware of. I'm asking for schools to train the front office staff and improve their messaging on advanced enrollment to highlight those benefits. Also ensure that every educator and administrator that interacts with our children has read the recent guidance and recommendations that the Department of Education developed for highly mobile students, and looking really closely at those IDE timelines. You know, military families, they're on the move and time is just not on their side. And what can we do at the DoD EFMP level? So we know that EFMP families interact frequently with service providers at military treatment facilities, with the SLOs, with EFMP staff. We're recommending adding training checklists for all of our service providers to gauge how our EFMP children are doing at every critical education point. We also need to look at that military student identifier, which we call MSI outcome data, and whether or not it's an effective tool in supporting our families as they move. And if it's not, how can we improve it? This data should be publicly available to military families so they can make informed decisions about which schools can best support their students. And last, educate service providers about these stressors that we've been talking about that impact special ed and EFMP families. Who can we partner with that can provide some caregiver support for this very unique demographic? And additionally, much of the stress is due to the inconsistent support offered at EFMP offices at every installation, whether it's providing support personnel to attend an IEP meeting, advocates, or offering more special education training. This support needs to be consistent among all the service branches, and there should be like a regular drumbeat for families to know what they can expect every time they move. This support all leads to creating effective IEPs and supporting positive education outcomes for their children with disabilities. And the last, so these are the recommendations that are most difficult to implement. We already know from last year's survey that highly mobile military children in special education face barriers to accessing an education. So how can we make these transitions smoother? The idea of creating portable IEPs would require amending federal law. We continue to recommend to our states to offer protections of allowing a military child to maintain their transferred IEPs at a new duty station for up to 6 months, and to add stability, which gives an opportunity to observe that new student in that new environment. And it also gives those parents confidence as they join a new IEP team. Also, more data is needed on military special education students. We need data on outcomes. We need it on graduation rates, testing, and MSI. Data is just not enough currently. This all needs to be reported and tracked. And last, we should consider amending Every Student Succeeds Act to capture this data. Similarly to the McKinney-Vento Act for homeless children, additional protections could be provided through state legislation for exceptional military children. And this is where Partners in Promise comes in. Families are kind of on both ends. They're either very informed about special education because they've had to, or they're not informed at all. There's really not a lot of gray area for our families. In this last survey, families reported not being fully aware of DoD resources that were available, and parents are still unfamiliar with federal and state level protections and policies. So we will be creating resources for families to better understand these topics of special education law, importance of setting long-term goals, how to stay on track for obtaining that standard high school diploma, because that is what makes you become an independent, productive member of society and really opens up the opportunities for you post-secondary. And we'll continue to elevate the voices of our families and share these stories because that informs solutions. There is no reason why military students should not receive an appropriate education based on their parents' military service. And we will strive to provide solutions and tools to support them. So this wraps up the first half of our webinar. Thank you to our very generous sponsors who helped make the survey research possible. We are grateful for the USA Foundation for their incredible support of our research and programming that made today possible. We also appreciate our partners, Lighthouse Therapy, Teleteachers, SEAL Kids, and Brehm Preparatory School for their commitment to wanting to learn more about how to better serve our community. Thank you to each of you for supporting military children with disabilities. And with that, I would like to welcome back Jennifer and Amy and bring in our panelists to discuss the survey findings and recommendations. We have Dr. David Cantrell with the United States Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs, also known as OSEP. OSEP supports a comprehensive array of programs and projects authorized by IDEA that improve results for infants, toddlers, children, and youth with disabilities. We also have Ms. Tomeshia Veterans with the Department of Defense's Office of Special Needs, which is also known as OSN. OSN was established to enhance and improve DoD support for military families with special needs and the EFMP program through policy, oversight of programs, resources, and training. We also have Ms. Cindy Cipoletti with Learning Disabilities Association of America. LDA's mission is to create opportunities for success for all individuals affected by learning disabilities through support, education, and advocacy. So Cindy's here to provide that context from the civilian special education community. Thank you all for joining us today. And I would like to first begin with our question for David, and you might need to unmute yourself, or all of you may unmute if you desire.
I'm good to go.
Fantastic. Okay, so last year, after participating in our survey webinar, the Department of Education released guidance to state directors on how to support highly mobile military students, which featured many of our recommendations. So I guess our question for you is, what are you hearing from families and educators about your guidance? Sure.
Thank you, Michelle. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I first want to start with the letter our Secretary Cardona issued last March, I believe, to all the state superintendents of education across the country and the territories, just re-emphasizing the need for states, districts, of course, and local schools to support the unique needs of students with disabilities who are connected with military families who either transfer within the 50 U.S. continental states or go back and forth to our DoD schools overseas, right? And the important thing about the Secretary's memo is it just reinvigorated the national conversation about the unique needs of military connected students, right? So I was very much appreciative of him issuing that memo, and then he's followed up with conversations with our state leaders as well. But then we found the need for my office to reissue our 2014 letter to state directors of special education. So we issued this letter actually on last Veterans Day, last fall. And the purpose of the letter was really just to underscore our expectation for states to work with the local military installations, the DoD schools that happen to be within the DDES schools within the United States, but also for those military connected students who, as I said earlier, are either transferring from overseas back to the US to many of the stateside installations, or between the DoD schools within the states, or just really transferring across the states, to underscore two main themes. First, that we really want local education agencies to expedite the evaluations within preferably a 30-day or less than 30-day window. But that also includes when students who have begun an evaluation, I think Dr. Schumann, you mentioned this earlier from the qualitative information, that when a student undertakes an evaluation in one stateside school or a DoD school, that information is real-time information, a point in time that is still very valid, but then the student transfers to another local education agency, right? Those parents should be very advocate for their student that information should be used to begin the evaluation or to complete the evaluation in the receiving local education agency or the school, right? We're hearing that still becomes an ongoing issue. The second point that I wanted to underscore in our letter that we issued last November was that extended school year services, we consider comparable services. What that means is that when a student has an IEP and the team has designated them to receive extended year services, which is that window when the school system shuts down from the spring and then they don't begin until the fall. Many LEAs offer ESY services for students who qualify for those services. What we're hearing, unfortunately, is that when the students have the IEP developed for the student to be eligible for those ESY services, but then the military family relocates either to another DoD school or to a new stateside school, that school is not acknowledging that those ESY services are immediately active. Now, our guidance through our memo says that they should be considered immediately active and considered comparable services so that those students receive those services until the time that the school begins for the fall session, right? Those were two main themes that we wanted to tee up in our letter that we issued last year. That being said, we know that we can always do a better job of getting the information out to the state leaders, the district educational leaders, but also at the school level for teachers and school administrators to know that there are unique challenges that we know in this small group that are faced by military-connected students. We really want those schools to consider the uniqueness of the individual family, the student's individual needs, to get them those services as soon as they need them. Our work isn't done. I call it the drumbeat. We're continuing the drumbeat just to support the military-connected youth, but more work to do, and thank you for inviting me for this discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Cantrell, and I appreciate all of those explanations about the guidance. I do have a question, though, before we move on to Cindy.
Sure.
What about the students that move to states that quote unquote don't have ESY or they're closed for the summer? We've heard from certain students who moved to various states that said, well, they don't offer ESY here. At least that's what I'm told when I inquire with the local school district. Have you heard any feedback about that before?
Yeah, so IDA, as we all know, is the federal standard, the minimum standard by which states and schools need to provide special education services to students with disabilities, right? States still have the autonomy to develop what are their criteria, their procedures for aligning with IDA, and then the districts have to align with the state, right? It isn't a situation that a district or a school cannot provide those services. The manner in which they are provided may look differently from districts to districts or schools to schools, right? So that's why I'm not surprised where some parents are saying, well, the district said they don't have ESY services, right? The idea behind ESY is that as a result of the break from the spring school year concluding and the fall school year beginning, that window would be so detrimental to the student's educational or social emotional progress that they need an extra boost during that window, right? Typically, it's for a 4-week period, right? So the manner in which districts approach it does look a little different. For example, one district will hire specialized teachers to have a 4-hour educational experience 5 days a week during that 4 or 6 week window. They may say that the students are eligible for one of those 4 days, or they may have tutorial services without having the standard like educational setting, right? So it is within the authority of the districts to craft their unique ESY services, as long as the ESY services are provided for those students who are eligible, right? So that's why you do see a variance. And from the parents' perspective, I can absolutely commiserate with them that it's so confusing, right? Well, when I was in North Carolina and they did it this way, and the DoD school in Germany did it this way, and now I'm back in Texas and it's another way, right? I apologize that in that instance, it can be very confusing. So all that we can try to do is just to underscore what are the rights of parents in terms of advocating for their children.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for clearing that up. We hear that question a lot. Where they're expecting the exact offerings that they have just received at a school district a year prior. So thank you. Thank you for letting us know the different ways to receive that. I appreciate that. Okay, well, don't go anywhere right now, but we are going to go talk to Cindy for a minute. So this is going to lead me to my question to you, Cindy. What are you hearing from the civilian community, and how does that line up with our survey findings today?
Thank you, Michelle. I would say that a lot of what we're hearing lines up pretty parallel to what you're hearing. The quality of special education services for non-military students is also highly dependent on the knowledge of the families and their understanding of special education law and their rights. The stories that you shared really resonate with us. Military families, you all have the stress of frequent moves and the other stressors that come with being military families. But a lot of families, especially where if they're single parent homes or we have 2 working parents, they really find it difficult to work to get their children the supports that they need. And it's exhausting and stressful. You pointed that out. And like Dr. Schumann, I've lived this process myself, having a 24-year-old son who has a learning disability. And I'm fairly knowledgeable in this area and still found the whole process very difficult. Since IDEA requires states to develop a method for locating, identifying, and evaluating children with or who are suspected to have disabilities, but since states have various criteria for that, how children are identified and who delivers the services is inconsistent not only across the country, but sometimes even within states. One school district to another, even within the same state, will have different services and may not agree with what the prior school district had in place for that child. And then you add on an additional layer for learning disabilities, specific learning disabilities, as are defined in IDEA, that states have to establish their own eligibility criteria for specific learning disabilities. So really, we're hearing the same thing, depending on where a family lives, students' eligibility for services and the types of interventions that they receive are greatly impacted.
Well, thank you, Cindy. We really appreciate your insights because, we're always trying to bridge that military civilian divide. And as we mentioned earlier, if we can get it right, for the military, hopefully this is something that we can replicate in the civilian community. We appreciate your partnership, and I know we'll have more questions for you in a few minutes. So thank you. Our next question is for Tomeshia Barnes. We know that the Office of Special Needs is at the helm of the Exceptional Family Member Program, EFMP as we call it, assisting those with disabilities in the military. First, would you please share an update with our families, specifically if there are any updates on how standardization is going, and two, how may EFMP families plug into what the Office of Special Needs is doing?
Thank you very much for that question. We do anticipate the release of the Department of Defense Instruction 131519 Exceptional Family Member Program this spring. With that update to the DoD, one of the things that you will see in policy is the standardization of processes and procedures. During the call today, Ms. Norma, one of the things you pointed out is just the differences at installation versus a different installation and or variances between services. So one of the things that we really wanted to do is establish standard processes and procedures for the program, because that actually enables families to really have firm expectations of what to expect from the program itself, but also from the people who are working the program. And so that was the key, making sure that families know exactly what to expect from the program and also what are the procedures within that program as well. To do so, we wanted to make sure that we established really firm communication to families. We know that we strive to do our very best in communicating outcomes and decisions to families, but we wanted to ensure that the policy really highlights that expectation that throughout this process, we want to make sure that there's no mystery to how decisions are made or what the decision was. And so we wanted to be firm and ensure that we put policy language and procedures in place that communication to families is firmly established. We also know that within the EFMP, when families enroll within the EFMP, that often families report not really knowing what's available to them. And so one of the structures that we are requiring within this policy update is requiring for families to be contacted upon enrollment so that they are provided with information on the wealth of services and supports that are available to them. We want to make sure they know that at the front end and not on the back end. Families do have a choice on what services and supports they receive, but we want them to be knowledgeable so that they have all the resources available to make informed decisions. A couple of additional key things that I will highlight, and I definitely want to be mindful of time, is that we also wanted to look at standard factors for determining the availability of services for individuals upon relocation. And so really reinforcing what the standard protocols and procedures are and making sure that we reinforce the standard factors to be considered for determining the availability of services, and also making sure that as decisions are made, that we do look at the individual needs of the families. As we're working to enhance and improve the Exceptional Family Member Program, that is a continual effort. This one thing that Dr. Cantrell said is, hey, we have more work to do, and we're in the same boat. There is more work for us to do as well. And we actually are actively working on additional efforts that will result in future policy changes and positive impacts for military families.
Well, we are very excited to hear about the DoD coming out this spring. I know that has been on everyone's mind for a while now, and we're just very excited about all the effort and hard work that your team has put into that, to know that the EFMP program will continue to improve and evolve, and be able to take a look at some of this data and hopefully be able to use that in some of those processes as well. So thank you so much, Tomeshia, for some of that information. And we have got a lot of questions, both in all the places in chat, and we got it through our registration. So I'm going to just go ahead and and start peppering them off. And hopefully you guys can unmute and join when you can. The first one has to do with finding number 3, the standardized testing. So the question is, should all students take standardized testing? How do we categorize that and help prevent schools from being penalized?
Let me respond in a couple different trajectories. So the importance of standardized testing at the national level, it really gives us a language to communicate in terms of how are the students performing under different, curricular areas, mathematics, science, language arts, right? There are always pros and cons to standardized testing, but what it does give us at the national level, and quite frankly, states at their level, is an idea of a range of where are the students performing, regardless of whether they have a disability or not, right? So this gives us a common language to speak from, right? That common language is really important because remember something I said earlier, that the states have the autonomy and the districts have the autonomy to develop. We don't dictate curriculum at the federal level, but the states and the districts have the ability to select their curriculum, their eligibility processes, how they go about instructing children, whether regardless of they have a disability or not, right? By having a standardized testing format, it does give us common language at the national level to identify where are those risks, where are the pinpoints for students, particularly at subgroups where they're performing lower than their peers, disabled students versus non-disabled students in mathematics, for example, right? Historically, there's longstanding data that students with disabilities perform lower than their non-disabled peers on standardized testing. The same thing with English language arts, right? But I do want to connect the participation in standardized testing with something I think Dr. Shumwun or Cindy, you mentioned earlier, with the outcomes of students with disabilities, right? We've got clear data to show that those students who are decided upon by the IEP team not to participate in the standardized assessment, oftentimes they're in a different trajectory, which turns out to be a regular high school diploma exiting path, right? Oftentimes, parents don't necessarily know when they're making that decision for their student not to participate in standardized testing, what does that decision cause in terms of subsequent decision-making and subsequent decisions, right? We've got data to show that students who have been decided not to participate in a standardized test, those decisions are based on perhaps low expectations that the student cannot perform well. It would cause unnecessary stress on the student. What would the data show for the student? But again, that goes back to low expectations, right? And then unfortunately, many of those students become on the trajectory for a certificate of attendance or some other type of certificate to exit them from high school, right? So my advice to parents is when they're in conversations with the IEP team about whether the standardized assessment is appropriate or not for their children, to have a really robust conversation and to try to get to what is the reason for the student not to be included in the standardized assessment, right? I would recommend that all students are participating in the standardized assessment because that should be a separate conversation than the one about the curriculum and the educational services and supports that they need, right? Because that should be unique to regardless of the trajectory, the educational path that the student participates in, right? So that's kind of a long-winded answer to standardized tests do serve their purpose, but parents, please remember that to advocate for your child with a disability, that they should participate in that standardized test.
Yes, Cindy.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. Thank you, Dr. Cantrell. And I would echo that we believe that all students should take place in the standardized testing. If we're not testing students, then we don't know how they're doing as a whole. And I would, I guess, suggest that maybe the more appropriate thing to do would, rather than excuse students from these tests or exempt them from the test, would be to offer appropriate modifications to students so that they can participate in the testing.
Thank you. And just to answer another question from the chat that was related to our findings and the types of questions we asked to get at this question. So we did ask a question that said, did your child participate in standardized testing in the 2021-2022 school year? And if not, we asked follow-on questions why. They were allowed to choose from a list of options and could select any that apply to them. So it is important to note that the most common answer was the fact that they were not eligible due to special education status, and that was a perception of the parent that they were uneligible. So it is important for us to do more research into, is this an indicator for alternate assessments, or is this a parent perception that they were not eligible? So definitely we need to have more research into this topic. And that's why we bring on our partners here to help with that and continuing that work. Sorry, Michelle, back to you.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for adding that in. I just think, again, having those conversations with that IEP team doesn't hurt to ask the same question over and over again each time, you know, you get to a new school district. I'm going to take a couple of, I think I can maybe at least do 2 more questions. One of the questions from registration is, what is the process for overseas families who have children in need of special education services? So I'm assuming that they're talking about, let's say you're in a DODEA school overseas. How would this be different than maybe determining that you may have a disability or identifying one here in the continental US? So maybe Tomeshia, this might be you.
Thank you. So I'll jump in there. I know that when we're thinking about it, and we're thinking about it from a DODEA school versus a public education location, the difference, but when we really look at it, there is no difference. DODEA is still held to go through that initial referral and evaluation process the same as a public school would. And if a parent has a concern and they voice that concern, then DODEA is charged with answering that concern and having that meeting where they're taking in that data. I know different states call it different things, but I always call it that initial referral, where you're coming to the table with the school professionals and you're addressing the concern of that parent. So I think there's like a myth that there's a different expectation or different requirement for a Department of Defense education school versus determining eligibility for special education in a public school. And there is no difference. DODEA is charged with, one, addressing that concern, having that initial referral, going through that process where they're documenting what the actual education, academic, functional concerns of the child may be, and making sure that they go through the process to determine if the child meets the eligibility criteria to receive specially designed instruction. So the short answer to that is they are required to follow that same process, and that should be what is happening, and that is the expectation.
Thank you, Tomeshia. I think that we received a lot of DODEA questions this time around. So just to make it clear, they still have the same process to go through to be able to see if there is an eligibility associated with a 504 or an IEP. And I think that that's super important. No matter where you are, you're still a student overall. So, and I know, Dr. Cantrell, you worked for DODEA many moons ago. So, I'm sure you're probably like, yes, that's absolutely right. Well, good.
Yes, absolutely. And when we do these again, we should probably have the chief of special education from DODEA participate, because I, as the former director of special education from DODEA, I could speak to that, but that's no longer in my wheelhouse. So
absolutely.
Fabulous idea for one of our subsequent reports where we're looking at the educator perspective. That would be a great perspective.
Sure.
Absolutely. And we'll send some questions their way as well. I think that we are almost going to wrap it up. I just wanted to first thank our incredible research team, our guest speaker, Ms. Casey, and our wonderful panelists here today for spending time with us and focusing on our military child in special education. We look forward to collaborating on many of these wonderful recommendations. Special shout out to our PIP team, Trisha Ross handling the things on the backside, Crystal Mahaney for monitoring the chat. Thank you. And for our audience, thank you for joining us. If you haven't already, please get on our mailing list to stay connected, to get some of these answers to the questions in our chat today. We're at thepromiseact.org. And also, as Jennifer had mentioned, we have additional reports that are going to be released throughout this year. Please make sure to stay tuned to us in our social media accounts so you can get the latest updates. Again, thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of the week, and we will see you guys soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.